Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
President Vladimir Putin says Russia-China ties have reached a truly unprecedented level ahead of his state visit to Beijing. The World Health Assembly has rejected the so-called proposal of inviting Taiwan to participate as an observer for the 10th year in a row. Argentina is in talks with China to extend a currency swap agreement despite continued pressure from the United States. Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia-China ties have reached an unprecedented level in a video message ahead of his state visit to China.
Дорогие китайские друзья, приветствую вас.
Greetings, dear Chinese friends. I'm delighted to be visiting Beijing once again at the invitation of my longtime good friend, the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. Regular mutual visits and Russia-China top-level talks are an important and integral part of our joint efforts to promote the entire range of relations between our two countries and unlock their truly limitless potential. I would like to remind you that 25 years ago, Russia and China signed a treaty of good neighborliness and friendly cooperation, which laid a solid foundation for a genuinely strategic relationship and comprehensive partnership for the benefit of our countries and our peoples. Today, Russia-China relations have reached a truly unprecedented level. Their special nature is reflected in the atmosphere of mutual understanding and trust, a commitment to pursuing win-win and equitable cooperation, conducting respectful dialogue, and supporting each other on matters affecting the core interests of both countries, including protection of sovereignty and state unity. Looking confidently to the future, Russia and China are actively expanding their contacts in politics, the economy, and defense, while broadening humanitarian exchanges and encouraging person-to-person interaction.
The Russian leader described the relationship as a stabilizing force in global affairs, one focused on peace and shared prosperity, not confrontation. To delve into this, let's have Professor Chu Qiang, a fellow of Belt and Road Research Center at Minzu University of China. Professor, President Putin says China-Russia relations have reached an unprecedented level. So in your view, what makes the current stage of China-Russia ties fundamentally different from previous periods?
Well, I think current China and Russian relations actually has been go beyond the friendship of just a neighbor. I think we have already seen, very much improved structures. Number one, I think the positioning is upgraded. For example, ever since 2019, both leaders actually has been co-announced this comprehensive strategic partnership of the new era. Actually, that has been elevated to a new quality. I don't think this is just a phrase. I mean, actually, lots of bilateral cooperation has been shifted from just a topic to the mutual governance and also strategic partnership and cooperation. Actually, from economic cooperation and also to coordination in the regional and international issues. So we become the partner in the international global initiative of the governance. And secondly, I think is what we've been doing together has been profoundly deepened. For example, before the visit, the interview of President Putin, before his visit to China, I think he mentioned the China and Russian relations has become unprecedented level. It's because we have unprecedented level of mutual understanding and trust, and also all the cooperation has been based on the equal and win-win foundation, and also most of the nations have a very, very strong mutual support in the core benefit. For example, like defend our sovereign and the unity of the nation. And also, last but not least, economy. Well, economy is probably the most important part in here. But, actually, it's also been improved a lot. For example, both sides' trade has been going beyond 200 billion US dollar. And 99% of the settlement has been done with, both of our own currency. which is fundamentally important because it's a milestone. It shows that two very important large economies actually can go detour around the United States and its currency and financial infrastructures. So which makes us very much immune to many of the original conflicts' impact. And our dependence relying on the third party has been much reduced.
Professor, to be more specific, President Putin described China-Russia relations as a stabilizing force in global affairs rather than an alliance targeting third countries. How should we understand this positioning amid rising geopolitical tensions today?
Well, I think Mr. Putin is actually correct. Traditionally, in the old world, in the old era, actually, when we're talking about international relations, it's always you or me, either you or me. You got to choose a side. There's no way to stay in between. We used to try the non-alliances movement, but not quite successful because the global South nation did not rise as an international important force at that moment. Now, I think global South, has been rising up as a very important pivotal force of the international, issues. And the China and Russia's, partnership is actually one of the reflection of that. So once again, we stayed to be the partner with each other. We actually coordinated on a very wide spectrum of the issues with each other, but it doesn't mean we're going to be, military alliances like NATO, or we're targeting at the third party. So we work together with each other. It does not mean we see some other party as our enemy. So this kind of today we see this kind of a very easy to understand principle, but in the previous era, this is a very unimaginable, and still in many Western observers, it's still not possible. But now China and Russia are setting an example in the global South nations and also in the South, in the whole world, to show that this principle actually can stand. And also, secondly, as we just mentioned, China and Russia's partnership stand as a very important part of the global South's rise. Currently, we've been seeing many geopolitical conflicts and regional turbulence are happening. So I think China and Russia, if these two nations can coordinate and stabilize this relation, I think it's providing a very stable anchor towards many global and regional issues. Well, at least you don't want to see this big part of the world territory to have another round of the turbulence, right? So if these two parts are working very good with each other, very peaceful, and economic cooperations are going on, so at least the whole world people, including the West, they will catch up with the breath and relax and say, okay, we know this part of the supply chain is not going around. We know energy supply and production here is stable. So it at least is a good news. And also it's showing that global South nations are rising as a stabilizer, more and more a stabilizer of the whole global issues and development. And thirdly, I think this is also a very proactive management of the diplomacy relation. For example, President Putin's visit is right after Trump's visit. I think this is also very important. It shows that we are not making any secret agenda behind the whole world between China and America or between China and Russia. So China wants to stand in the neutral zone. We want to coordinate. We want to be stabilizer. We want to make peace of the whole world. So actually, this are showing that we are very frank, and also we try to be the proactive force in the whole world.
Then building on that, President Putin emphasized regular leader-to-leader meetings as essential for unlocking the limitless potential of bilateral cooperation. As earlier you mentioned, with both the U.S. and Russian leaders visiting China in close succession, how do you assess the role of head of state diplomacy in today's increasingly complex international environment?
Well, the answer is very simple. China is important, and China can help. China has already become a very important anchor to the world stability, for the world, for the countries big or small, no matter it's from Trump or from President Putin, from America, from the West to the East, from the North to the South. China matters not only through all kinds of the supply chain arrangement, because if China fully stopped, the whole world will see a disaster economically. Did you remember when we have the coronavirus, when China has been suspending its capacity only for several weeks the whole world inflation has become a flood, unstoppable, until China has been back online with its capacity. This kind of a turbulence has been stopped. And also, China has become a very important anchor of the stability of the politics internationally. When China can coordinate many, international geopolitical conflicts, so we can actually cool down many sides. If you remembered, Saudi Arabia and Iran used to have its moment of confronting with each other, but China successfully coordinated them in 2023. We know even though currently they're still having, many fuss over each other, but remember, this is America and its member alliances has agitated this war, so Iran and Saudi Arabia have to stop their friendship with each other, or at least a peaceful relation with each other. So it's not Iran or Saudi Arabia's fault. It's the fault of the one who started this war. And China actually used to play a very vital part in this peaceful relation, and now it's continuing to play this part. And not only I think, is to coordinate between all the countries that have a stake in this conflicts, but also for all the adjacent countries and many others who will be impacted by this kind of geopolitical conflict. China are also helping. That's the reason why you can see the leaders from the Central Asia, from ASEAN nations, from Europe are all visiting China, letting alone all the big nations leaders are visiting China as well. It shows that China has been go beyond the traditional paradigm of the diplomacy and has become a transcendental being in international diplomacy. This is going beyond over the mindset of the Cold War. This is a showing that the big nations can become very, very different, can go beyond. We do not need to confront anyone. We can stay who we are peacefully and become a stabilizing and development-oriented force of the whole world.
Professor, beyond politics, as this year marked the 30th anniversary of the China-Russia Strategic Partnership of Coordination, do you expect the relationship to enter a new phase or receive a new strategic definition?
Of course. I think currently these, development or this, of course, I think this, mutual visit, especially in this very complicated international backdrop, can become a very important guidance for lots of the country and people to look at. So when we see major countries can stay peaceful and stable with each other, and they've been setting up the tone, I think many people will listen. And secondly, we can work out mechanisms so we can release the pressures through the valve. For example, the emergency hotline, the coordination between the military forces. So people will know, well, the bigger ones, the bigger guys wouldn't, fall into chaos. So still the situation can be manageable. And also when there's two sides are talking to each other, it means more opportunities are still being creating in the current international conflicting bubble. For example, when we see America and China are still having a lot of the trade, when we see China and Russia are still having a lot of the trade, so many surrounding nations will see, okay, we will have a lot of opportunities, even though part of the world are, in the chaotic situation. The whole world, main two, are still development.
Thanks, Professor, for those insightful analysis. That was Professor Chu Qiang, a fellow of the Belt and Road Research Center at Minzu University of China. Coming up, the Road House Assembly has rejected the so-called proposal of inviting Taiwan to participate as an observer for the 10th year in a row. This is Road Today. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Yan Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
This is World Today. China says its position on the Taiwan region's participation in international organizations, including the World Health Organization, is consistent and clear. The statement came after both the General Committee and the plenary session of the ongoing World Health Assembly rejected the so-called proposal of inviting Taiwan to participate as an observer. This has been the 10th year in a row that the WHO has rejected the so-called proposal concerning Taiwan. Beijing reiterated that Taiwan's participation in international organizations must adhere to the One China principle. For more on this, joining us on the line is Dr. Liu Kuangyu, a researcher at the Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Liu.
Thank you. This is Kuangyu.
First of all, the WHO has blocked Taiwan-related proposals for 10 years in a row. What does that tell us about the international message here?
Yeah, it's a 10 years, consecutive 10 years of rejection. In my view, I don't think it's just a procedural formality. I think it sends a resounding signal about rock-solid international consensus on the One China principle. When we look at the WHO, which is a specialized UN agency, the message is quite clear. There is simply no room for so-called Taiwan independence in the global governance architecture. And a decade-long streak of rejection highlights that the vast majority of the international community recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate representative of China itself, and it tells us any attempts to use so-called health as a disguise for political separation are seen through by the world. And no matter how much external interference or lobbying occurs, and the international framework remains steadfast. It serves as a constant reminder to the DPP authorities that international space cannot be decoupled from cross-strait political reality. And ultimately, these repeated rejections aren't targeted at the Taiwanese people themselves, but rather at the DPP authorities' persistent attempts to exploit global health issues to advance their separatist agenda.
Mm-hmm. We see few supporters of Taiwan's participation in the WHO argue that excluding Taiwan creates a gap in the global public health system. Beijing has described this argument as a purely political lie. How do you assess this? Will there be a gap?
I would assess this as a classic case of conflating technical needs with political maneuvering. I think the Chinese mainland is very right to call this a political lie. The reality is that Taiwan has never been blocked from accessing crucial public health information sharing, and though mechanisms arranged under the One China framework, it is very solid. Taiwan's experts have historically participated in technical meetings and received timely alerts on, for example, like infectious diseases and informations and alerts from these. So the so-called gap only appears when the DPP insists on using a non-existent so-called country's name to participate, trying to squeeze into the WHO meetings rather than the pragmatic arrangements already in place. So it's actually an artificial, manufactured crisis by insisting on a political label that the international community does not recognize the DPP's actually the one Putin politics above the health of the Taiwanese people. So the gap isn't a result of exclusion by the WHO or Beijing itself inflict wound caused by the DPP's refusal to accept the existing functional channels. And also, I have one example for this. I mean that I don't think actually the DPP, although they are talking about the health issues, the healthcare, the public welfare of the Taiwanese residents, and all the day when we come to this issue, but actually I don't think they really care about the health, public health or social welfare of the Taiwanese residents. For example, Lai-Ching administration just a couple of months ago, not quite long from now, their so-called a Bureau of Investigation, a so-called security team from the Bureau of Investigation, they have been investigating on one of their legislators called Gao Jin-Su-mei, who is from the native Aborigine group, who is very famous for her sincere service and also a very strong stand on pro-cross-strait exchanges. Because The reason why they are investigate on him, because at the year of 2012, when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak, Gao Jin is trying to acquire from the Chinese mainland a lot of tests, a lot of masks, and a lot of other materials from the Chinese mainland to spread them in Taiwan for their people to use. So the Lai Ching administration, they are not thanking Gao Jin Sumei and Chinese mainland for helping the Taiwanese when there's a crisis, when there's shortage of the materials. They say, well, this is a so-called security issue, and you are suspicious and you are dangerous, and so they're trying to arrest you. So you can see what's the weight of. So one thing is public health, and one thing is their interest of their pro-independence separate forces. You can see the weight on the balance of the DPP.
We know Taiwan is a domestic question for China, and the Chinese leaders have repeatedly emphasized the One China principle to the international community, including to U.S. President Donald Trump, especially his state visit to China last week. Later, he told Fox News that he does not want to see Taiwan move toward independence. How do you interpret Trump's remarks and the signal they sent?
This actually is a very pragmatic and reality-based statement, because when Trump stated that he does not want to see Taiwan moving towards independence, that's essentially another way of saying the United States current administration opposes Taiwan independence. Because in the past China-U.S. summits, Beijing's readouts would often include language about Washington's position of not supporting Taiwan independence. Yet that phrasing typically stay confined to closed-door meetings. It was almost very rarely repeated when U.S. officials, the presidents, faced the cameras. But this time, President Trump said it openly, directly to the media. So through the president's own voice, America's stance has never been expressed more clearly. So it signals, I think, the U.S. understands the fundamental danger of Taiwan independence, triggering a catastrophic conflict between China and U.S. From the more strategic perspective, Washington knows that unilateral declaration of so-called independence by, for example, Lai Ching-te will force Beijing's hand and potentially dragging the U.S. into a war it doesn't want. And Trump's remarks serve as a warning to the DPP: don't expect a so-called blank check for independence from the U.S. It reinforces this idea the U.S. interest lies in managing the status quo, not overturning it. And this sense, I think, it showed down the spine the Taipei's separates who fantasies about the U.S. backing for their dream. And it's a reminder that for the U.S., of course, Taiwan is a bargaining chip, not a sacred cause towards a world order, because the Trump administration has already expressed very clearly that Taiwan independence is far exceeds any conceivable benefit, and Taiwan is important interest, but non-existential.
One last question, very briefly. Where do you see the most realistic pathway for cross-strait relations to move forward?
Yes, I think we need to return to the basics. For example, like economic integration and cultural exchanges, and those non-political bonds we need to strengthen. For example, like the dual city forum model between Shanghai and Taipei, and it shows that practical cooperation on, for example, like urban governance, like public health and trade can thrive even without so-called any political agreement between the administrations.
Thanks, Dr. Liu Kuangyu, a researcher at the Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. This is World Today. We'll be back after a short break. You've been listening to World Today with me, Anna, in Beijing. Chinese technology companies are driving a new IPO boom on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Since the beginning of this year, 53 companies have listed in Hong Kong, raising a combined 158 billion Hong Kong dollars, up 570% year on year. Among them, 48 companies are from the Chinese mainland. The latest wave of listing has been dominated by high-tech companies, especially in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and high-end manufacturing. For more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, first of all, what is driving Chinese tech companies listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, do you think?
Well, I think there are three major reasons. One is that it is clear that these companies, they are listing in Hong Kong. They also have the so-called dual listing. So some of them already, or if not all of them, have already listed on the mainland exchanges. And then they utilize secondary listing in Hong Kong to broaden their shareholder base and to increase liquidity and to leverage the Hong Kong Mainland Stock Connect scheme. So it's not just an exclusive listing only in Hong Kong, but a lot of these are dual listing companies. And I think the second reason to choose Hong Kong is because this is really, the city really acts as a vital offshore fundraising and operating hub for mainland companies. So it is a really gateway for these companies for their overseas expansions. They're able to list here to test global markets, to build international credibilities, and also to expand their operations worldwide. So Hong Kong really serves this very particular and very valuable sort of a gateway. And the third reason, I think, is that the Hong Kong markets have a lot of favorable regulatory reforms to really expedite these tech companies. For example, they have the technology enterprise channel to expedite the listing for the pre-revenue tech companies and facilitate the dual class share structures. So in other words, the standards of listing is really accommodative for some of these tech firms. So I think given those three reasons, the dual listing opportunities, the access to international market through Hong Kong, and the favorable regulations, I think this is the reason where we see now a lot of companies are listing in Hong Kong.
And what does the growing number of high-tech IPOs tell us about the transformation of China's economy, do you think?
Well, I think we know that China is experiencing a massive tech IPO boom. And this is especially concentrated in the so-called hard tech sectors like AI, semiconductor, robotics, and also biotech. So I think for one, this is a regulatory pivot that, again, facilitate the listing of these tech companies. So for example, we saw in Hong Kong, there is explosive, over 230% increase in the IPO proceeds. So there's a lot of, I would say, regulatory and policy support for tech companies to IPO. But more importantly, I think, as you mentioned, this really reflects a bigger trend of the economy. So the Chinese economy now are really leapfrogging in many of these technological developments. And so you see companies that are really thriving and really fast growing in semiconductor industries, advanced robotics, biotech, and many others. So I think this kinds of technological development really help to build up this sort of IPO boom. For many companies, they're raising capital and they're trying to facilitate the continuous technological development and to commercialize, to monetize their technological innovations. And last but not the least, I think we're also seeing the maturing financial ecosystem. So I think the Chinese venture capital and also local private equity funds, they're now streamlining their investment to exit pipelines. So in other words, on the one hand, you have the economic sort of transformation, industrial upgrading, technological innovations that push these companies to be established, to raise funds, to support their continuous innovations. And then on the other hand, you have financial ecosystem that is being built up to raise funds, to really scrutinize and support these promising tech companies. So I think this is really a symbiotic relationship between the real economic side with the technological development and the financial side to support the kinds of technological innovations and tech companies to continue to develop and to monetize.
And you mentioned China's technological breakthroughs from AI, quantum computing to robotics, this kind of new quality productive forces. So how will these innovations inject fresh momentum into the global economy? And which sectors are likely to share the most significant growth?
So I think the new quality productive forces is really having the sort of a two-tiered dimensions, right? So one is to foster technological development, and second is to really diffuse these technologies. So now I think a lot of the emphasis is put on, for example, commercial robotics, quantum tech, and then biotech. So these technologies, on the one hand, there are a lot of breakthroughs and to develop, AI models, to develop robotics technologies, autonomous robotics, and then, a lot of computing, the cloud services, the quantum tech. So once you have these technology developments, the next step then is to really diffuse these technologies into the more traditional industries. So example would be, once you develop the humanoids robots technologies, you can install them into the manufacturing to promote high-tech manufacturing. You could also utilize them for, say, tourism sector to, other service sector like healthcare, like education. So this is the way I think that China is perceiving or conceiving how technology is going to, drive the total factor productivity and become the quality productive forces that would really help to promote broader economic growth and transformation. So I think this is really helping also the global economy because China's technology is widely embodied in its products. So when China, for example, exports, BYD cars, it is really helping the rest of the world to accelerate the green transition and to share the kind of green tech with the rest of the world. So I think the development within China not only helped to propel China's own economic development and transformation, but really help the global south, especially when it comes to technological development, energy transition, and also sustainable development.
And despite global economic uncertainty and market volatility, we've seen China's Chinex and stock market have also reached the record high early this year. So what key factors are driving this strong momentum? And what does it reveal about the resilience and evolving strengths of China's capital markets?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So, the Shenzhen's Chinex index has recently crossed the historic 4,000 point mark. And I think that is an indication that, there's a lot of technological dynamism within the Chinese markets. And it also has attracted a lot of the global investments. So I think there are, I would say, at least four driving forces for the kinds of market surge. One is, as I mentioned earlier, there is this global trend of AI development and adoption, and China has been achieving many technological breakthroughs in hardware, software, and semiconductor industries. So these companies have experienced massive valuation upgrades. So that's why I think that the investors are really seeking the opportunities to invest in these AI-related technology-related enterprises. And second is I think there has been ample liquidities when it comes to unprecedented retail and margin leverage. So in other words, a lot of borrowed capital being invested into semiconductors, electronics, and telecom stocks. So with that kind of leverage and liquidity, it attracts a lot of investments. And third, I think, is that when it comes to geopolitical and trade tensions, they have been easing. I think that now there has been, more stable relationships, especially I think within China compared to the global turbulences. So I think the kinds of macroeconomic and political stability in China has made it very attractive for global investors. For example, many of the Middle East Gulf states' investment funds, sovereign wealth funds, they wanted to put money into China because the market is stable, it's open, and it's dynamic. So I think that becomes also very attractive. And finally, I think is what we have mentioned earlier, at the macro level, there's a shift towards the new quality productive forces. So that means there is a more sustained growth in the economy driven by the productivity growth. And that would also translate into the micro level in terms of corporate earnings. They have been performing very well. So it's really about business fundamentals rather than just pure speculation that I think attract global investments.
That was Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University, speaking with Zhao Yang. Argentina is in talks with China to extend a currency swap agreement despite continued pressure from the United States. The president of Argentina's central bank, Santiago Basile, confirmed that officials will travel to China next month to negotiate the renewal of bilateral swap line, which is set to expire in August. Basile noted the currency swap arrangement between Argentina and China has a 17-year history and is typically renewed on a 3-year cycle. Argentina was the first Latin American country to sign a currency swap agreement with China. To delve into this, let's bring in Dr. Cao Ting, the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Fudan University. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
Professor, amid sustained pressure from the United States, including public calls from officials such as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and a former Latin American envoy urging Argentina to terminate the agreement, Argentina has stated that it will proceed with renewing its currency swap line with China. So how do you interpret this decision, especially given President Milei's traditionally pro-U.S. foreign policy stance?
Well, first of all, I think this means that Argentina wants to promote this kind of cooperation with China because the currency swap cooperation with China has brought many benefits to Argentina. And at the same time, although we know that the Milei government has maintained close interactions with Trump and has followed the United States on many issues, it still maintains a certain degree of autonomy in its diplomacy towards China. And third, I think U.S. assistance cannot resolve Argentina's fiscal difficulties and the debt crisis. And Argentina has recognized the importance of maintaining diversification in its economic and trade cooperation with China.
The U.S. has described this China-Argentina currency swap as a coercive mechanism, while Argentina itself calls it an economic stabilizer. From Argentina's perspective, could you please elaborate more on how important is this agreement to Argentina?
Well, first of all, I think it supplements foreign exchange reserves and alleviates the dollar shortage of this country, because we know that Argentina has long faced a severe shortage of dollar reserves, and the renminbi obtained through the currency swap can be regarded as additional foreign exchange reserves. And this renminbi can be directly used for international trade settlements or exchanged for US dollars in international markets. Second, it ensures external debt repayment and avoids sovereign defaults. Argentina is burdened with huge external debts, particularly its debts to the International Monetary Fund. And the renminbi provided through the currency swap offers valuable debt repayment funds for Argentina. For example, in 2022, Argentina used the renminbi to repay $2.7 billion of external debt that matured that day. And third, it promotes bilateral trade and reduces transaction costs. Because China is Argentina's second largest trading partner and is also a major export market for its agricultural products, such as soybeans and beef. Using renminbi instead of US dollars for settlement can facilitate the bilateral trade between Argentina and China. At the same time, it also facilitates the work of Chinese enterprises which invest and operate in Argentina.
Professor, from a broader perspective, the United States has been urging Argentina to decouple economically from China. But what financial support and cooperation mechanisms does Washington offer at the time? Because many analysts argue that Latin America's economic vulnerability is partially linked to dependence on U.S. financial systems. What's your take on this point, and how do you assess the sustainability of the U.S. Latin America cooperation model?
Well, last year, in October of last year, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that U.S. financial support for Argentina, including a 20 billion currency swap line financed through the Treasury Department's Exchange Stabilization Fund. And we know that Latin America's heavy dependence on the United States has a long history that can last for more than a century. And the sustainability of this kind of model is being challenged. In particular, the traditional tactics of the U.S., for example, use debt dollarization and sanctions as control tools, have made Latin American countries realize the need to diversify their cooperation partners. This includes, for example, the currency cooperation with China, as well as partnerships with emerging multilateral financial institutions, such as the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
About the swap agreement, some analysts argue that de-dollarization in Latin America is less about replacing the US dollar and more about risk diversification. Countries are not abandoning the dollar entirely, but seeking more options. So in this context, is the use of RMB settlement in Latin America becoming a broader trend?
Well, yes, I think so, because promoting the use of renminbi in Latin America is supported by practical needs and a solid foundation of bilateral economic cooperation. For Latin America, it can reduce the financial vulnerability caused by the dollar dependence and strengthen the region's economic autonomy. Last year, during the fourth ministerial meeting of the China Select Forum, China announced several new initiatives to support Latin America's development with bilateral and multilateral cooperation, from traditional trade to technology, finance, and infrastructure. So this mechanism provides further impetus for deepening the international use of the renminbi. And currently, monetary and financial cooperation between Latin America and China has begun to show positive results. So going forward with the joint efforts of China and Latin American countries, I think the use of renminbi in the region is expected to expand even further.
Thanks, Professor, for those valuable insights. That was Dr. Cao Ting, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies of Fudan University. Coming up, China has further optimized departure tax refund measures for better convenience and to expand inbound consumption. This is Road Today. Stay tuned.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
You've been listening to World Today. China has rolled out upgraded departure tax refund measures for better convenience and to boost inbound consumption. The new policy expands tax refund store coverage and promotes paperless processing. It also allows cross-port recognition for instant tax refunds upon purchase, with the refund deadline extended to 28 days. In the meantime, a random inspection system will apply to small-value tax refund applications starting July 1st. The measures come as China's departure tax refund sales nearly doubled last year, while the number of refund applications tripled year on year. For more, my colleague Lian Qingxuan spoke with Professor Liu Baocheng, director of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics.
So, Professor Liu, what are the biggest upgrades in this new departure tax refund policy? And what improvements will foreign travelers benefit most?
The way I see it is that the most important upgrades are the system-wide move towards an integrated approach of simplification, digitization, and faster refunds. In addition to it, China also has been rapidly expanding those instant refund stores that are qualified for offering such sort of service in more cities and stores. So that has significantly reduced the paperwork through the paperless processing and also improved integration with the mobile payment system. Because we are receiving more foreigners in terms of hundreds of millions. So the biggest benefits are the time saving and convenience for those visitors here in China. That also help those vendors, big and small, because this way they are able to be more attractive for those tourist visits. And also automatically they can offer such sort of service with convenience and also with hospitality. So if you compare with many other countries who only are able to have the refund process at the airport. So this is a unique advantage in China.
The new policy introduces random checks for tax refund applications under 10,000 yuan, or about $1,400. So why was this threshold chosen? And will it affect regulatory efficiency?
I understand the 10,000 yuan threshold reflects a risk-based regulatory approach. Transactions below this level are generally routine tourist purchases with lower fraud risk, while the higher value transactions tend to require close scrutiny. This is there to protect the Chinese market order, and also that's there to prevent certain fraudulent behavior between the fake purchasers versus those fake vendors. This design improves the regulatory efficiency by giving more assurance for a genuine, authentic purchases. So it allows customs and tax authorities to focus resources on higher risk and high value transactions, while simplification procedures are there available for the majority of those small purchases after all.
Yes, and the new policy fully adopts paperless tax refunds. So what practical benefits will this bring, and what challenges remain in cross-department data sharing?
For any tourists, particularly those long-haul tourists, they are very time sensitive because they have very packed agenda in visiting here and there and dealing with friends, etc. So the benefits are very clear. It reduces the waiting time and lower the human error, with the support of digitization. It also improves transaction traceability, because if there is any problem with the product, they can have a recourse with clear evidence, enhances the overall efficiency for both consumers and authorities, together also with vendors. However, there are some sort of challenges in the cross-department data sharing and system integration. The tax bureaus, customs, the commerce and payment platforms, they need deeper coordination, which is still on the top of agenda for continued improvement. There are also some issues of standardization across regions so that they are able to have a synchronized approach in the real-time verification at any type of exit points. So the other issue is that foreigners can really have access to refund if they decide to purchase online while they are traveling in China. And this is also another issue that the regulators need to look at.
Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen are testing new models like one order, one package, one code, and citywide tax refunds. So can these models be expanded nationwide?
Definitely, because this is really a coordinated policy issued by our central authorities and looked after by our regulatory watchdogs. So these models, they have a very strong potential for a nationwide expansion. But if we look at the process, it tends to be rather gradual and phased type of approach. So large cities, they have a stronger incentive because they are the recipient of more of the tourists. And they are also equipped with more of the mature digital infrastructure. And those officials and even vendors are better educated. And so therefore they are positioned at the first tier to implement the new process. But those smaller cities, as more of the tourists are penetrating into the countryside, so those recipients, they also need more additional upgrades in their regional digitization and custom coordination. So in the long run, these pilots can really evolve into a national-wide standard system built through the regional scalings.
Yeah, and last year's tax refund sales nearly matched the total of past decade, while the number of applicants tripled. So what caused this sharp growth, and how can China further use the tax refund system to boost inbound consumption and domestic demand?
Fundamentally, we have been receiving an increasing influx of foreign visitors into China. So the number of tourists are really the driving factors on one hand. And the other is that there is a strong recovery in the expansion of the Chinese vendors with more of the assurable quality. And also the Chinese vendors are more prone to receive the digitization process. So third element is that the refund eligible stores are really on rapid expansion. There has been a wider adoption of the instant refund mechanism, improved payment convenience for those visitors. And also visitors, they have also overcome a certain learning curve as how they can really benefit from this type of policy, from understanding into real application. So to further boost our inbound consumption, China can really expand more of the awareness policy by better communication with the global community, and particularly those tourist agencies can be better educated to communicate such sort of policy advantages. And vendors also need to do more of the market research to bring more varieties and also to have more quality assurance. So eventually, the customs and tax bureaus also need to work closely to standardize and further expedite the process for the refund.
That was Professor Liu Baocheng, Director of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics, talking to Lian Qingxuan. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Anna in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.